Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this virtual Chester Cathedral on the 11th of 12 talks on Mark's Gospel at lunchtime on Wednesdays until next week. Next week is the final talk. They are planned lunchtime talks, so do eat your lunch as you're listening. And today I'm delighted to say we welcome the Venerable Ian Bishop, Archdeacon of Macclesfield, who's going to talk to us on the final chapters of Mark's Gospels, starting at chapter 15, verse 16. But before I hand over to Ian, I'm going to say the prayer that we've used through all the series for the second Sunday in Advent, the Collect, for Cranmer's version. So let us pray. Blessed Lord, who has caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant that we may in such wise hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that by patience and comfort of thy holy word, we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which thou hast given us in our Saviour, Jesus Christ. Amen. So Ian, a warm welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We're looking forward to hearing you. Over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be with you. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak this afternoon. You're coming towards the end of the Gospel of Mark, and I know that you've had some brilliant contributions to this series. I think I've seen 7 of them, and I intend to catch up with the others as soon as I can. What I've managed to land myself are the very minor issues of the crucifixion and the resurrection to deal with all in one session out of 12. Well, seems like somebody ought to speak to whoever planned this, but there we go. This passage is the climax of St. Mark's Gospel. This is what the whole Gospel has been moving towards from the beginning. Now, I'm going to try and share my screen a bit with you as we go, so anything could happen right now, but we'll see. There we go. I hope you can all see that. Mark's been building towards the cross ever since the pivotal point in the Gospel that was Peter's confession of Christ in chapter 8, when in answer to Jesus' question, well, who do you say I am? Peter replies, you are the Christ. And the question was always then, well, what does that mean? What sort of Christ are we talking about? And 3 times in Mark chapter 8, verse 31, chapter 9, verse 31, and chapter 10, verses 33 to 34, Jesus tells them he is the Christ who's going to suffer and to die, and specifically that he will be betrayed by one of them, handed over to the chief priest, condemned to death, mocked, spat upon, flogged, and killed. Crucially, though, he also says 3 days later he'll rise again. Well, he couldn't be much more specific, really, could he? I'm always astonished then that the disciples always seem somewhat surprised by the turn of events. Death and resurrection was always intended to be the climax of where we were going. And as I pick up the story, the long night that started in Gethsemane and that finishes with Jesus being dragged to the Praetorium in Jerusalem is coming to an end, and the long day is beginning. Pilate has been woken at dawn to pass sentence. Now, I don't intend to dwell on the story because I think you know it pretty well, but Jesus is about to go through a day like no other. I'm going to try and tackle this today in 3 parts. Firstly, I'm going to go on a whistle-stop tour of the day's events to try and pick out a few interesting items and Mark's theological points. Then secondly, I want to think about the way that Mark highlights the role of women in the events of the crucifixion and resurrection. And finally, I thought it might be interesting to go off at a bit of a tangent and do a bit of archaeology with you. So, if you're ready, we'll dive in and make a few points about a story I know that you will know so well. Well, as dawn arrives, the trial by Pilate ends. and Jesus is handed over to be crucified. The mocking of Jesus by the military in verses 16 to 20 of chapter 15 is a story that you find in all four Gospels, though in Luke it's actually Herod's soldiers. The King of the Jews, is he? Isn't he? Well, that was the question Pilate, of course, articulated in chapter 15, verse 2. Are you the King of the Jews? And that question won't go away as we go through this last and longest day. It was that title that Pilate effectively awarded to him. He shouted to the crowd, if you remember, "Shall I release the King of the Jews?" And then it was, of course, written on the sign above his head, the King of the Jews. And this is how Jesus dies. It's worth noting that throughout Mark's passion narrative, Jesus' enemies effectively and unwittingly proclaim the truth about him. And that's what's happening here. The ironic sign that would go above his head turns out to be the revelation of truth. Well, history is littered with terrible tales of occupying forces acting brutally, and in the scene in the Praetorium, the brutality is shocking. Some of it is simple mockery, of course. The purple robe is a mockery because kings loved purple as the royal colour. But some is deeply violent. The thorns in the crown that he was awarded as the king were long and sharp and would have pushed deep into his skull. The beating he received was probably from a centurion's staff, and they wouldn't have held back. This was humiliation and degradation and violence of a shocking nature. And already exhausted from his trials through the night, such brutality in the morning, I think, would have finished most of us. Let me go back one. There we go. Oh, two. There we go. Well, the soldiers dragged Jesus onto the streets. Normally, those condemned carried their own crossbeam. When Jesus was too weak to do this, the soldiers conscripted a Jewish man visiting Jerusalem from North Africa known as Simon of Cyrene. Now, Mark adds the little detail that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Well, perhaps that's an indication that Mark knew Simon's sons well. Just interestingly, the assumption is that Mark was actually an eyewitness of these events. Possibly the young man who fled naked from Gethsemane the night before, who by morning had dressed and mingled with the crowds watching the events unfold. Related to Barnabas, he travelled the Mediterranean with Paul and Barnabas, not always with good results, it has to be said. But arriving in Rome, he then writes down this gospel. Probably at the time the persecution that led to the execution of Peter and Paul was taking place. Somewhere after AD 65, but before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. Well, if Mark was writing in Rome, then one of Paul's greetings at the end of his letter to the Romans may be significant. "Greet Rufus," says Paul, "chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who's been a mother to me also." That's Romans chapter 16, verse 13. Maybe, just maybe, this African man, the first to carry the cross, was in fact married to a woman who was foundational in St. Paul's and St. Mark's ministries. A man who came to Jerusalem as a worshipper of God, who then carried the Lord's burden all the way down the Via Dolorosa to Golgotha. Maybe that man developed his own faith in Jesus by what he saw and passed it to his wife and sons, who were then key to the gospel development and to the development of the church. Well, even more intriguing is the possibility that the ossuary of Rufus's brother Alexander has actually survived. Ossuaries are stone boxes used to contain a person's bones after the body had decomposed. Well, in 1941, some first century ossuaries were found in a tomb in the Kidron Valley. One of them, this one you see here, had several inscriptions saying Alexander of Cyrene, son of Simon. Well, there can't have been that many Alexanders who were the son of Simon from Cyrene in Jerusalem in the first century. But the question is always, well, did these contain the bones of the man whose father carried the cross? Well, I like to think so. Well, Golgotha was the place of crucifixion. Then, of course, it was outside the city walls, but the walls have been extended, and now the site, probably covered by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is now inside the walls. Mark translates Golgotha as the place of the skull. It's difficult to know exactly what he meant by that, but it probably just meant the place of executions. But it does rather heighten the horror of the scenario before us. There's no question that Mark wants his readers to understand that this is a terrible place and this is a terrible moment. But having said that, I think we should all realize that all the gospel writers spare us the true picture here. All the gospel writers are actually quite restrained in their description of what happened at the crucifixion. The horror of what crucifixion involved is too terrible for even them to put on paper. We are clear, though, that this was a terrible suffering for Jesus, the very worst of suffering, probably the worst way that anybody has ever invented when it comes to executing somebody. I did think about going into the whole details, but recognizing that this is a lunchtime event, I kind of thought I'll steer clear of describing the sheer horror of what crucifixion was all about. One of the interesting things is that he was actually stripped totally naked. We're pretty sure of that. Jewish sensibilities, though, even on that point, were ignored here. The gospel writers talk about how the soldiers gamble for his clothes. And the humiliation that this would have been to a Jew cannot be understated. Here, hung on the cross, naked, utterly broken and humiliated. It's always interesting to me that when you see portrayals of the cross in art, that Jesus' modesty is pretty much always preserved. That was never the case when it came to the cross. Well, the custom was to fix a placard on the crossbeam. Indicating the crimes of the condemned man. And in Jesus' case, the crime in the eyes of Roman law was that he claimed to be the King of the Jews. There's that phrase again. In other words, this man is a nationalist guerrilla. As he draws his last few breaths, the mocking continues. I think it's interesting why Mark chooses to record two particular insults, because I'm sure there were more. In fact, we know there were more from what Mark says, but he chooses to quote these two. You, who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down and save yourself. And then he also says, you saved others, save yourself. But that's the point. This is not about Jesus saving himself. He could presumably have done so. These are Paul's words in Philippians chapter 2, lived out in the death of Jesus. Being found in an appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. This was about the Lord's obedience to the calling that was given to him. His obedience is our salvation. I think Mark is also saying here that this is really the King of the Jews, the true King of the Jews. And because of that, because of all that salvation history has been building to from the Exodus through the Old Testament to this moment in history, this is his task. This is his royal task. And therefore on the cross, he must remain until it is finished. The mocking and the taunting and the shame and the humiliation come together with the dark extremes of pain and torture as the inner core of what it all meant. The reason why the cross gives faith and hope to Mark's little community in persecuted Rome, and why he still gives hope to all those who suffer for the faith today. This is how the kingdom comes. This is what it's all about. It's about sacrifice. It's about sacrifice that is driven by love, selflessly, in poverty, and powerlessly. And so the death of Jesus happens. The skies darken as the darkest point in the history of the world before or since approaches. And then the death, sooner than expected, because some criminals took days to die. And the temple veil is ripped apart. And then finally, the extraordinary remark of the centurion. The centurion is a key figure, it seems to me, in the Passion narrative, because his words link up the key theme in the entire gospel. The gospel starts right at the beginning, chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And now, not the high priest, not a leading rabbi, not even a loyal disciple, but a battle-hardened thug in a Roman uniform, used to killing humans without thought, announces to the world about a broken young Jew hanging above him. Surely this man was the Son of God. Now I suggest to you that this is absolutely staggering. There is something in those last few hours that so touches that soldier that he becomes the herald of the gospel truth. This is the Son of God. And remember, Mark is in Rome, and the tale is almost as if he is saying to the might of Rome, look, even one of your centurions at his weakest point recognized the truth about him, that he is the Son of God. So why can't you recognize him now? That question comes down the years, the centuries to us. And the temple veil is ripped from top to bottom, which, whilst Mark leaves that without comment, is clearly meant to indicate that the temple is as good as finished. Its use as the focus of worship has just been overturned. From now on, access and the focus to worship, to the presence of God, is open to us all in this Son of God. Well, I could say lots more, but time is skipping on, and the other Gospels have other moments, of course, that they recall in the Passion narrative. And it's worth sometimes just taking time to read each of the Gospels one after the other and let the story of the crucifixion touch you deep inside. Well, what does it all mean? Why did Jesus die? Well, Mark deals with that at several levels. He gives us three: the will of God. Secondly, because he was obedient. And thirdly, because of the wickedness of his enemies and the treachery of Judas, which is fine. But of course, that's not the doctrine of atonement as we've come to understand it. What Mark has been doing has been giving us some ideas. So twice he refers to Jesus saying that he dies for many, like a ransom. Chapter 10, verse 45 and chapter 14, verse 25. But you can't separate his death from his resurrection when you're looking for meaning. Death was never meant to be the end. All the prophecies he's been quoted as giving have made it clear that death doesn't separate him from anything, because he might die, but he will drink wine in the kingdom. Chapter 14, verse 25. He will lead his disciples into Galilee. Chapter 14, verse 28 and chapter 16, verse 7. He will be raised up by God to be the chief cornerstone. Chapter 12, verse 10. They're all prophecies that show us death was never to be the end. The life of the new community depends upon his death, yes, but equally it depends on his resurrection. And Mark concentrates on the passion narrative, but that makes no sense without the resurrection. So let me take you back to the events that are unfolding. Jesus is there on the cross, and at some point in those hours, an awful realization must have dawned upon Jesus' followers gathered around the cross, that when the end finally came, as it surely would, Jesus' body would simply be thrown into a common grave along with other criminals who were being crucified that day. Joseph of Arimathea is described as a rich member of the Sanhedrin who'd not consented to the Jewish council's verdict on Jesus. Luke tells us that in chapter 23, verse 50 of his gospel. Well, we don't know whether he was a follower or just someone with huge admiration for Jesus, but he did have a family tomb. And that family tomb happened to be nearby in a garden, not far from the crucifixion site. And he had the influence to ask for the body. But don't underestimate the risk that he was taking in asking. No doubt the religious authorities would have not been pleased at all with Joseph's maneuver, not least because Jesus' body was once again within Jewish rather than Roman jurisdiction, and they would have rather washed their hands of the whole thing. But this was late Friday afternoon. The Passover preparations by now were well underway. Time was short. The Jewish leaders probably wouldn't hear about what had happened until hours later. So Joseph asks for the body, and permission is given. Well, linen cloth was purchased hurriedly. John tells us that Nicodemus, another friend in high places, purchased the dry spices, and with the women watching, I'll come back to them, and perhaps John, helping the two men, they carried the dead weight of the corpse into Joseph's tomb. That alone tells you it wasn't far. They couldn't have carried that weight far. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, watched, probably with other women. And if you check the other Gospels, and they clearly planned to return to deal properly with the body as early as possible after the Sabbath. Luke then deals with the resurrection in 8 verses. Not much, really. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate about the disputed end to Mark's Gospel. Very kindly, Jane invited me to stop at verse 8 of chapter 16, rather than going on to the disputed verses beyond, which I'm delighted to leave to another day and somebody else. But let me depart from the text at that point and just imagine for a moment. Let me go back to my screen share. Saturday was a very quiet day in Jerusalem. Who knows what thoughts raced through the heads of those who had journeyed with Jesus? But that day there must have been some strategic planning going on. This is where I want to briefly stop and just think about the astonishing role that Mark gives the women in this story. He mentions that at the foot of the cross were several women. He names some of them, but makes it clear there were others there as well. There's Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. Interesting, he picks those three out. They followed the group from Galilee, which is incredible in itself that they had taken such a journey at such a dangerous moment in the ministry. But Mark also talks more about more women from Jerusalem who were there. We know some of them from the other Gospels. I'll come back to them as well. Well, there is much speculation as to how this all works out in terms of a family tree. I rather like Gordon Wenham's hypothesis that I think he came up with in the 1970s. So let me go back again. I thought I'd give you a bit of a family tree. This is pure hypothesis, but I think it kind of works. Wenham speculates that Galilee was a very small place, and especially the towns from where everybody came from. In other words, everybody knew everybody else. They were probably related. Now, I've done my family tree, and I come from a very small part of Wiltshire, where everybody knows everybody else, or at least they did when I was growing up. And truth be told, everybody was probably related to everybody else. In my class at school, I had 2 cousins or 2 second cousins. And it was a bigger place than Jesus lived in terms of population. As you can see here from Wenham's ideas, Mary, mother of James and Joseph, as Mark refers to her here, is probably the Virgin Mary itself. I could say more, but it does perhaps explain the close friendship of Jesus and John, who were probably close cousins. It also explains Salome as probably Mary's sister, and as the mother, that intriguing mother, who wanted James and John, you'll see them, the cousins of Jesus on the family tree, to be at the right and left hand of Jesus when they get to his kingdom in heaven. It also connects up with a tradition that makes Cleopas Joseph's brother. That's also Alphaeus in some of the Gospels. I offer it to you just as a simple illustration, not necessarily proof, but an illustration of just how close the disciples' group really were. Let me just come back to you. The other Gospel writers mention Joanna and Susanna, who are really interesting characters. Very different from the Galilean extended family. They probably lived in the Hasmonean palace. Joanna was the wife of Chusa, who was head of Herod's household. Now, I take that to mean like he was the home secretary. Susanna is a bit more elusive, but clearly a wealthy woman. It was they, amongst some of the other women, who effectively bankrolled the earthly ministry. Now, it doesn't take too much speculation to realize that this band of women were probably strategizing all day Saturday. Those wealthy women would have acquired what was needed to properly prepare the dead body on the Sunday, and would have got the messages out around Jerusalem to ensure that everyone knew the plan. The 9 disciples we know very little about. Speculation is that they were probably hiding in Bethany, where Mary Magdalene and Mary, the wife of Clopas, probably joined them. Mary, the mother of Jesus, and possibly Peter and John were probably staying with Zebedee and Salome in the city. Salome caring for her sister through the pain of watching her son die. But messages would have been passed out to Bethany as the Sabbath sun set. And so all the women rise before light on the Sunday morning and rendezvous in the garden. But just note all this focus on the women. It's there in the text. The men are here hardly playing a role at all. When you go back over the gospel, you suddenly realize that they appear throughout the gospel in different ways. And they, not the disciples, are there at the end. Mark acknowledges their significance at every stage, and we know that they cared for the disciples, covered the costs of the ministry, and demonstrated extraordinary faith and courage. You all know that first century Judaism saw no such importance for women, and their prominence in the story is bizarre at the very least. Time again doesn't allow us to explore this more fully. I just simply want you to note that the church, at least until very recently, failed to see that this story, this extraordinary tale of courageous, articulate, intelligent women was always meant, I believe, to lead to societal change over the role of women, not for the church to follow society. We should have been in the forefront in the fight for the equality of women, because that was where the apostles, I think, positioned us by the gospel stories. Personally, I continue to despair that we still have those who cannot see this as a gospel imperative. Because when I read the crucifixion and resurrection narratives, and I know that this is sometimes controversial, I see Mark saying to everyone who has the courage to read what's going on here, look, it was the women who witnessed the events. It was the women who carried the pain. It was the women who made the decisions. It was the women who largely funded it. It was the women who were the first heralds of the new dawn. It was the women who made this happen. Why then are you not embracing this and understanding the gospels drive the battle for gender equality in the church and in society? To me, I have to say, and again, personal view, it makes no sense that we continue to marginalize women when that wasn't even done on the first day of the new post-resurrection life. I'll now come off my soapbox. Let me change the tone. I'm going to try and finish with a thought about the resurrection in a moment, but I wondered if you might just find it interesting to just try and understand what happened after the resurrection. What became of the tomb of Jesus? Did it survive the tumultuous events of the next 100 years in Jerusalem? Can we have any idea where the crucifixion and resurrection actually took place? Now, in one sense, of course, it doesn't matter. The gift of the Spirit of God means that we don't need shrines to be close to God. He is here. His Spirit is with us. Well, there are different hypotheses, but one endures. That in AD 325, a tomb was uncovered, which from that date to this has generally been accepted as the authentic tomb of Jesus. You can find it today in what we know as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. During his life, Jesus predicted again and again the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened, of course, in AD 70. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And I don't have time to dwell on the city's history, but revolts and sieges just kept happening to that poor place. After the destruction of AD 70, Emperor Hadrian renamed the city Aelia Capitolina and began relaying the road system. The Crucifixion Site was outside the walls at the time, but close to the city, and became the obvious place for building. So it was the natural place for a new Roman forum or marketplace, and it was flanked by a temple to Jupiter, Minerva, and Juno. And the Jews, as far as they could, were exiled from the place. So that within 100 years, the Jerusalem that Jesus knew had completely disappeared. But the people of faith began to return. Jerusalem itself became less important. Caesarea Maritima on the coast became the capital of the Roman province for a while, and ultimately the key see for the Christian church that was emerging. By 231, Caesarea Maritima had collected, amongst other scholars, the great Origen as its chief theologian. After the death of James, the leadership of the Christian community in Jerusalem seems to have been kept within the family of Jesus for as long as was possible. Eusebius lists the first 30 bishops of Jerusalem. And we know well that in AD 95, Emperor Domitian became so convinced that two surviving relatives of Jesus, the grandsons of his brother Jude, might pose some political threat. But gradually, the Christian community in Jerusalem became a much more Gentile body. Converts to Christianity began to arrive in Jerusalem, and many scholars think that they wanted to find out everything they could about Jesus and heard the stories that there were of the crucifixion and resurrection, and they began to venerate the places that were associated with the events of the crucifixion and resurrection. Jerusalem, as a place of significance, also began to re-establish itself, and throughout the 2nd and 3rd century, there's a steady trickle of significant pilgrims who go and record their visits. They include Melito, Bishop of Sardis in AD 170, Alexander, who went to pray about 200 and then immediately got elected as Bishop of Aelia. Origen himself went, as did Paeonius of Smyrna. And there must have been others, but not everyone, of course, recorded their visits. But apart from Melito, none actually identified the site of crucifixion. But Melito suggests that it was in the marketplace, which matches the physical redevelopment of the city undertaken by Hadrian after AD 70. And then in 324, Constantine, the Roman Empire in the West since 312 AD, wins a decisive battle at Adrianople over Licinius, the Eastern Emperor. And Constantine becomes the emperor of West and East, and remarkably, publicly embraces the Christian faith because of this. Well, there's lots of opinions as to why that happened, but for Palestine, it was highly significant because for the first time, Jerusalem comes under Christian rule. The name reverts to the historic name Jerusalem, and the trickle of pilgrims to Jerusalem becomes something of a flood, not least Helena, Constantine's mum, herself a devout Christian. And so began one of the most extraordinary episodes in history. Archeological excavation in the 4th century to demolish the pagan temples and the Forum in order to find the 1st century tomb. I can't tell you all the political shenanigans that went on around that. It all gets tied up with the discussions at the Council of Nicaea. And there's a battle royal between Archbishop Macarius and Eusebius. You can read the accounts of the Council of Nicaea for yourselves if you wish. But Macarius wins permission to dig, heads for Jerusalem, and in 325 AD, against all expectations, a tomb is found. And the site has ever since then been marked as the Holy Sepulchre. I'm going to show you a little bit of how that may have emerged. There we go. Now, if you can see that on your screen and look at the bottom illustration down there, you've got the land on which the hypothesis that you've got the site of the crucifixion, which is that little rocky knoll there, and the site of the resurrection, which is somewhere about here. And on top of there, they begin to build. They begin to build very quickly. So by 10 years later, there is already a construction of a church, a basilica. Now, it is a discovery that does stand examination, and the fact that there is a rocky knoll just meters away from the tomb site, which looks like a small hill, it just authenticates the picture of the way those few followers left at the cross carried the body of Jesus across that short distance to Jesus' resting place. Which brings me to the last 8 verses. Oh, before I do that, let me just go on. There you have the interior of the Holy Sepulchre today. There you've got the tomb. Doesn't look much like it would have done in Jesus' day, but the tomb of Jesus in the Holy Sepulchre. And here you have the chapel of the crucifixion, and just under the altar there you can see the rock on which the crosses were placed. So the theory goes. I have to emphasize these are all theories. But that brings me to the last 8 verses. As the women gather, as agreed, in the darkness just before dawn, you can sense their anxiety. The 2 Marys have probably travelled through the early morning from Bethany. The planning has one problem. How will they roll the pretty large stone away to gain access to the tomb? While peering at the place in the half light, something is wrong, but beautifully right. The stone is rolled back. A young man dressed in white is sitting there. Who is he? What is he? Fear grips them, and the words are given. Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. You'll remember that they had seen the place where he'd been laid. They'd witnessed the dead body. Now, go tell his disciples, who were probably in Bethany, and Peter, who was probably in Jerusalem. He is going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he told you. And so the story begins. The women become the first apostles, those who tell of the risen Lord. They take the story, and it explodes across the world. There is still so much to say about the evidence for the resurrection. I could have had a whole session on that, and why we trust that this did actually happen. It still bears investigation, but I've run out of time. This is no conjuring trick with bones, though, let me say. It is the greatest story ever told. But even in saying that, I'm tempted to stop myself. This is no story. This is his story. This is history. And the tale continues every day as the implications of that weekend that changed the world continue to reverberate in your life and in mine and millions of others around the world. Well, I'll stop there. I'm happy to field any questions should you have them.
Thank you so much, Ian, for taking us through those last few words. That was fabulous. Has anyone any comments or questions they would like to contribute or say at this stage? No, silence is golden, Ian, and I think everyone just wants to take away what you've said and think about it and reread those chapters, perhaps. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful thing to be able to listen to. Next week is Liz Shercliffe, Reverend Liz Shercliffe, who's going to summarise all the ones you've been attending all this time. And thank you for those who have come every single week. It's been wonderful to see you every week. She's going to summarise next week all the weeks that we've had together. Tim, the Dean, will be hosting that one. So Tim will see you at that point. I'm away next week, so sadly I will miss it in reality, but I will catch up when I can on YouTube. So thank you very much for coming, and Tim will see you next week, certainly. Thank you very much, Ian.